I was fired at 8:12 in the morning, during a meeting shorter than a coffee machine's warm-up cycle. By 4:46 that afternoon, I submitted a resignation letter containing 0 threats. The next morning, cash flow froze, shipments halted, and partners invoked contract clauses the board had never bothered reading. When the sun rose again, the arrogance of the CEO's son came with an exact price: $800 million. My name is Ivy Perry. I am 41 years old, and for the last 12 years, I have been the Digital Infrastructure Deployment Risk Coordinator at Kestrel Arc Systems. It was a Tuesday morning in Dallas. It was early 2026. The sky outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of our executive suite was a brilliant, unforgiving blue. The Texas sun was already baking the asphalt on the interstate below, a stark contrast to the climate inside. Conference Room B was aggressively air-conditioned, the temperature dialed down so low that the chill seeped through the fabric of my suit jacket. It felt less like a meeting space and more like a holding cell where a sentence had already been written, finalized, and stamped before the accused even walked through the door. The calendar invite had appeared on my screen exactly 9 minutes earlier. It had no agenda, no context, and no attached documents. It simply demanded my presence and listed 3 other attendees. In the high-stakes architecture of corporate infrastructure, a sudden, context-free summons from the executive suite is never an invitation to brainstorm. It is an ambush. You do not survive 12 years in risk mitigation without developing a finely tuned radar for disaster. As I gathered my leather portfolio and my silver pen, I knew exactly what was waiting for me. I just did not yet know the specific flavor of arrogance that would deliver the blow. I stepped into the room and took the lone empty chair opposite the door. Across the vast expanse of polished mahogany sat a tribunal of 3. In the center, presiding over the execution, was Gavin Whitmore. He was the acting chief executive officer, a heavy title he wore like a lightweight, custom-tailored suit purchased with a platinum card he did not have to pay off. His father, Roland, the actual founder and visionary of Kestrel, was in Tokyo finalizing a multi-year expansion deal spanning 2 continents. In his father's absence, Gavin had been handed the steering wheel of a multi-billion-dollar machine. He possessed a specific, highly dangerous breed of confidence. It was the unearned swagger of a man who had inherited a fortress and fundamentally believed he was the one who had quarried the stone and built the walls. Flanking the young prince were his enablers. To his left sat Mara Sloan, deputy head of legal. To his right was Blake Harlan, the vice president of strategic initiatives. Mara was intently studying the grain of the wood table, picking at a microscopic flaw near her fingernail as if the solution to our corporate liability was hidden in the varnish. Blake was staring at a completely blank legal pad, his jaw set in a rigid line of faux seriousness. He radiated the smug, untouchable aura of an executive who believed he was revolutionizing the entire digital infrastructure industry simply by highlighting rows in a spreadsheet and pressing the delete key. Neither Mara nor Blake met my eyes. Their silence in that room was not neutral. It was a heavy, calculated cowardice. They were not going to throw the stones, but they were perfectly willing to stand by and watch the execution, hoping the blood would not splatter onto their pristine white collars. Their refusal to speak was infinitely more brutal than any direct insult Gavin could have hurled at me. Gavin, however, did not waste time with corporate pleasantries or false empathy. He leaned back in his leather chair and steepled his fingers, a power gesture he had undoubtedly studied and practiced in front of a mirror. "Ivy," Gavin began, his voice smooth and entirely devoid of gravity. "Let us get straight to the point. The market landscape is shifting rapidly. Kestrel needs to be younger, we need to be faster, and most importantly, we need to be cheaper. We are carrying far too much legacy weight across our operational divisions." I did not blink. I kept my breathing even and my posture straight. Legacy weight. That was the sterile, sanitized corporate buzzword they were using to describe experience. I managed the deployment risk for billion-dollar hyperscale data centers. My job was to ensure that when we laid thousands of miles of fiber optic cable across 3 states and powered up server farms that consumed more electricity than small industrial cities, the insurance underwriters, the Tier 1 banks, and the tax partners did not panic and freeze our operational capital. I was the failsafe. Your department, Gavin continued, waving a hand dismissively in the air between us, is a bottleneck. We have evaluated the entire operational flow with Blake's team, and frankly, the risk coordination tier is a cumbersome middle layer. It is redundant. We are migrating all of those checks and balances into the new automated process software rolling out next month. We need agility. Ivy, we do not need expensive bureaucracy. I looked at Blake. He offered a tight, artificial nod, clearly proud of his strategic vision. He honestly thought an automated dashboard could negotiate a grace period with a panicked underwriter when a supply chain collapsed. I turned my attention back to Gavin. I kept my voice perfectly level, maintaining a tone so calm it usually forced intelligent men to pause and reevaluate their positions. "Is this about performance, Gavin?" I asked, looking directly into his eyes. "Or is this because you do not understand what I am holding together?" Gavin smirked. It was a thin, bloodless smile that did not reach his eyes. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, invading the space. "This is 2026, Ivy," he said, dripping with condescension. "Institutional knowledge is no longer as valuable as the speed of cutting costs. The board of directors wants a lean machine. They want aggressive margins. You are an expensive manual override in a system that we are now fully automating. It is nothing personal. It is just math." I did not raise my voice. I did not demand a generous severance package or threaten a wrongful termination lawsuit. I did not list my 12 years of flawless financial audits, nor did I remind them of the 3 separate, highly classified occasions where I had personally prevented the company from defaulting on technicalities that would have triggered catastrophic cross-defaults. Pride is an entirely useless emotion when the guillotine blade is already in freefall. Instead, I simply leaned forward, resting my forearms on the cold, polished wood of the table, mirroring his posture but projecting absolute stillness. "Before you pull the plug and remove my role from the operational system," I said, enunciating every single syllable with deliberate, icy precision, "I highly recommend that you and Mara sit down in a quiet room and read Schedule R. Read the master facility appendices. Read them very carefully before you delete my credentials." Mara finally looked up from her cuticles. A brief, fleeting shadow of annoyance crossed her face, as if my suggestion that she actually read the foundational documents of our financing was an insult to her legal degree. Blake just suppressed a heavy sigh, shifting his weight in his chair. He was clearly eager to wrap this up so he could rush to his next meeting and boast to the executive committee about how he had successfully eliminated a massive legacy cost center. Gavin ignored my advice entirely. He slid a single sheet of thick watermarked paper across the mahogany table. It was a standard termination agreement. Immediate effect. His signature was already scrawled at the bottom in thick blue ink. "We have top-tier legal counsel, Ivy," Gavin said smoothly, gesturing vaguely toward Mara. "We are entirely comfortable with our contractual landscape and our risk exposure. Human Resources will pack up your office and courier your personal items to your home address by the end of the day. Your access to the Kestrel network, including your email and all internal databases, will be revoked in exactly 5 minutes." I picked up my silver pen. I did not bother reading the boilerplate text designed to strip me of my rights. I signed my name at the bottom of the page, executing a signature that merely confirmed receipt of the document, not agreement with its flawed premise. I stood up slowly, smoothing the front of my skirt. I looked at the 3 of them one last, lingering time. Blake looked triumphant, his mind already calculating the bonus he would demand for this cost-saving victory. Mara looked profoundly relieved that the messy human element of the transaction was over. And Gavin Whitmore looked exactly like a spoiled boy who had just successfully smashed a complex, vital machine simply because he did not understand how the gears turned. I turned my back on them and walked out of conference room B. My heels clicked against the pristine marble floor of the executive corridor, laying down a steady, measured rhythm that echoed off the glass walls. As the heavy, soundproof door sealed shut behind me, cleanly severing my 12 years of dedication to Kestrel Arc systems, I realized something strange. I did not feel a single shred of sorrow. I did not feel the sharp sting of betrayal. Nor did I feel the panic of sudden unemployment. Instead, as I walked toward the elevator bank, what filled my mind was a singular, chilling question. Did they just fire the woman holding the master keys to the company's lifeblood? Or do they genuinely believe they just dismissed a highly paid, expendable office worker? In a corporate ecosystem, visibility is usually equated with value. If you are the executive vice president of global sales, your value is measured in the deafening ring of the closing bell. You bring in the revenue, so you get the corner office with the panoramic view and the applause at the annual retreat. If you are the chief financial officer, your value is the ledger. You dictate the budgets, you control the margins, and so you are feared and respected in equal measure. If you are the lead counsel, you are the shield. You keep the executives out of federal prison and protect the intellectual property, so your word is law. But I was none of those things. I did not sell server space to tech giants. I did not balance the quarterly earnings reports. I did not draft the non-disclosure agreements or litigate contract disputes in a courtroom, because I did not fit neatly into one of those three highly visible pillars of corporate survival. 99% of the employees at Kestrel Arc Systems had absolutely no idea what I actually did for a living. To the junior analysts, the marketing team, and even the middle managers in operations, I was just a quiet woman with an impeccably organized office who occasionally asked very pointed, deeply uncomfortable questions about supply chain logistics. To understand why my invisible job was the only thing keeping the lights on, you have to rewind to a disaster that Kestrel suffered a decade ago. It was a dark period the old guard referred to quietly as the Denver collapse. Back then, Kestrel was trying to build its first mega campus in Colorado. The regional project manager, desperate to secure his end-of-year performance bonus, falsified a progress report regarding the installation of the primary industrial cooling systems. He claimed the chillers were fully operational and tied to the grid when they were, in fact, still sitting in shipping containers in a rail yard in Chicago. It was a small lie, designed to buy a mere 14 days of breathing room, but in the world of hyperscale digital infrastructure, small lies are detonators. The syndicate of investment banks funding the build discovered the discrepancy during a routine site audit. The reaction was instantaneous and brutal. They did not just freeze the funding for the cooling systems, they triggered a cross-default clause. Overnight, all construction halted. The contractors walked off the site. The company stock plummeted 40% in 48 hours. Kestrel was mere days away from filing for bankruptcy protection, completely paralyzed by a total evaporation of institutional trust. We survived the Denver collapse, barely, but the trauma permanently altered our relationship with the entities that held our leash. The banks, the massive insurance conglomerates, the tax equity partners, and the anchor tenants demanded a blood oath. They refused to ever again trust the unverified word of a Kestrel executive whose personal wealth was tied to the company's stock price. They demanded a structural guarantee. They demanded a neutral arbiter. That is when I was brought in to build the contractual trust architecture. It was a painstaking, miserable process of negotiating with deeply paranoid financiers and risk-averse underwriters. I designed a system where Kestrel surrendered a specific margin of its own autonomy in exchange for access to billions of dollars in capital. As part of that architecture, I was legally designated as the named completion certifier and the transition risk officer. That word named is the crucial part of the equation. It was not a generic title that could be passed around like a parking pass or delegated to an automated inbox. It meant my actual, legal identity was hard-coded into the covenants of every major loan, every master insurance policy, and every tenant lease agreement. I was a legally binding neutral party, and my role could not be arbitrarily replaced by a sudden internal management decision. The reason this role existed is entirely modern and terrifyingly practical. Building a data center is not like building a shopping mall. It is a fragile ecosystem of hyper-advanced technology. If a single milestone is misrepresented, or if a critical power vendor is swapped out without the correct regulatory approvals and safety audits, hundreds of millions of dollars can be sequestered in escrow accounts immediately. I negotiated a mandate that dictated every single major capital disbursement required my signature. Furthermore, I structured my own compensation so that it was entirely decoupled from Kestrel's stock performance or quarterly revenue targets. I received no shares. I received no performance bonuses tied to early completion. I was insulated from the political pressure of the boardroom. I had absolutely no financial incentive to lie to a bank to make a quarter look better than it was. I was the designated pessimist, the human failsafe who verified that the concrete was dry, the fiber was lit, and the legal liabilities were neutralized before a single dollar moved from New York to Texas. Over the course of 12 years, I utilized that authority to save Kestrel from its own worst impulses. There were two distinct occasions where aggressive project managers tried to cut corners on fire suppression systems, and I refused to sign the certifications, preventing what would have been catastrophic capital callbacks from our lenders. There were 3 separate instances where I caught minor compliance deviations that would have given our insurers the legal right to hang completion certificates in limbo, essentially stalling billion-dollar campuses indefinitely. I fixed those emergencies quietly. I made the hard phone calls. I demanded the vendor corrections, and I submitted the clean paperwork, because I did my job perfectly. There was never a crisis. And because there was never a crisis, there was never any applause. My success was defined by the absence of disaster, which meant my victories generated zero halo effect. When Gavin Whitmore took over the temporary leadership role, he did not see the history. He did not know about the Denver collapse. He looked at the corporate ledger through the lens of a spoiled heir, trying to prove his ruthless business acumen to his absent father. When he looked at my profile, he did not see a master architect of risk mitigation. He saw a single row in a master spreadsheet. He saw a massive base salary attached to a woman who did not code software, did not sell real estate, and did not directly generate profit. He looked at the cost of the safety net and decided that the trapeze artist was simply too expensive. Blake Harlan encouraged this fatal delusion. Blake was desperate to walk into the next board of directors meeting and present a revolutionary restructuring plan. He wanted to use buzzwords. He wanted to call Kestrel leaner, younger, and bolder. He wanted to claim that by replacing manual oversight with automated compliance software, he had accelerated decision-making by 50%. Blake believed that removing friction was always a virtue, fundamentally failing to understand that sometimes friction is the only thing stopping the car from sliding off the edge of the cliff. Mara Sloan was perhaps the most professionally negligent of them all. As the deputy head of legal, it was her explicit duty to understand the company's obligations. But Mara was a creature of convenience. She read the executive summaries prepared by overworked junior associates. She reviewed the highly condensed slide decks. She never bothered to descend into the digital archives to read the actual binding appendices of our syndication agreements. She never read the microscopic print that explicitly stated the transition risk officer could not be removed without a 90-day notice period and the unanimous written consent of the lead underwriters. The fundamental difference between me and the 3 executives who fired me could be summarized in a very simple image. We were all standing on a massive, highly complex suspension bridge spanning a bottomless gorge. I was the engineer who spent every single day inspecting the tension of the steel cables, calculating the wind shear, and understanding exactly why the bridge remained suspended in the air. Gavin, Blake, and Mara simply drove their luxury cars across the asphalt every morning. Because the bridge had never fallen while they were driving on it, they looked at the massive steel supports, decided they were an eyesore, and concluded it was perfectly safe to dismantle them. They simply saw the bridge standing there, robust and seemingly invincible. They did not understand that the entire structure was a deliberate, continuous act of defiance against gravity, and they had just fired the only person who knew how the physics worked. I did not need a hidden microphone planted inside Conference Room B to know exactly what transpired the minute the heavy oak door clicked shut behind me. In the modern corporate world, the immediate aftermath of a high-profile executive execution is always a highly predictable sequence of mutual backpatting and aggressive, poorly considered forward motion. Gavin Whitmore did not pause for a moment of quiet reflection. He did not take a single breath to consider the structural load-bearing walls he had just knocked down. Instead, he immediately convened a secondary, impromptu alignment session. I know this with absolute certainty because the metadata on the digital calendar invites generated shortly afterward left a very clear, highly incriminating forensic trail. Gavin treated my departure not as a delicate structural shift, but as the triumphant slaying of a mythological dragon. He undoubtedly poured himself a glass of expensive sparkling water, leaning back in his ergonomic chair, entirely satisfied with his own manufactured ruthlessness. Blake Harlan, riding the intoxicating high of the moment, immediately seized the opportunity to escalate the severity of the action. Blake was a man obsessed with optics, and he knew that half measures did not secure board promotions or land you on the cover of business magazines. Standard operating procedure for a role as deeply embedded and highly sensitive as mine mandated a mandatory 30-day handover period. It was a basic safety protocol, a buffer zone designed to ensure continuity of operations and to prevent catastrophic systemic shocks to our ongoing construction projects, but Blake argued vehemently against it. If we keep her around for a month, it completely dilutes the message, Blake insisted, his voice echoing in the sterile, aggressively air-conditioned room. The board of directors wants to see a decisive pivot. If we allow a 30-day transition period, it looks like we lack confidence in our new automated systems. It looks like we are afraid to pull the bandage off quickly. We need a clean break today. It shows strength. It shows we are fully committed to the new lean model. Gavin, desperate to maintain his newly minted image as an uncompromising visionary leader, turned his attention to Mara Sloan. He needed the legal department to rubber stamp this immediate decapitation so he could move forward without looking back over his shoulder. Can we seamlessly transition the signatory authorities to Reese Dalton by noon? Gavin asked, his tone implying that anything other than an immediate affirmative would be a sign of incompetence. Mara did not hesitate. She did not open a single physical binder. She did not log into the encrypted compliance drives to review the actual covenants. She simply gave a curt, professional nod. Internally speaking, yes, Mara confirmed smoothly. The executive charter grants the acting chief executive officer full discretion to reassign internal reporting lines and approval matrices at will. We can designate the chief financial officer as the new primary sign-off for all project milestones immediately. Internally speaking, those two simple words were arguably the most expensive qualifiers ever spoken within the glass and steel walls of Kestrel Arc Systems. Mara was entirely correct about the internal corporate bylaws. She was, however, completely tragically oblivious to the external reality. Not a single highly paid executive in that room bothered to open the master facility appendices. They did not review the heavily negotiated, meticulously drafted documents that explicitly stated the signing authority did not belong to Kestrel alone. The legal right to appoint a new certifier was massively encumbered. It strictly required the affirmative, written consent of the entire lending syndicate, our primary insurers, and our tax equity partners before any internal transition could take legal effect. Ignorant of the massive legal trap they were enthusiastically setting for themselves, Gavin picked up the sleek conference phone and dialed the Director of Information Technology. The orders he barked into the receiver were crisp, definitive, and immediate. He demanded the immediate revocation of my network credentials. He ordered the termination of my virtual private network access. And most crucially, he instructed the IT department to comprehensively scrub my name from the master disbursement control dashboard. Gavin wanted Reese Dalton's name populated in every single approval field before the executive dining room opened for the lunch service. He wanted my ghost completely and utterly exorcised from the digital machine within 2 hours. While Gavin was busy erasing my digital footprint from the company servers, I was sitting in the back of a black luxury car heading toward my apartment, watching the screen of my corporate phone suddenly go black as it wiped itself back to factory settings. A moment later, my personal mobile phone buzzed in my purse. It was an email from the Vice President of Human Resources, containing a hastily drafted document titled Transition Consulting Addendum. The sheer audacity of the document was genuinely breathtaking. They wanted me to remain available on a purely freelance basis to answer complex questions, untangle potential messes, and smooth over any friction points that might arise during their glorious automation rollout. The proposed hourly rate was insultingly low, but the financial compensation was not the truly offensive part. It was the liability clause. The addendum explicitly and deliberately stripped away my corporate indemnification. They wanted me to continue bearing the immense legal and ethical risk of verifying multi-million-dollar infrastructure milestones, but they absolutely refused to provide me with the necessary power, the required system access, or the legal protection to actually do the job without destroying my own life. This was the critical turning point of the entire disaster. This was the exact moment their arrogance sealed their fate. A smarter, more experienced executive team would have kept the door wedged open. They would have swallowed their pride and offered me a highly lucrative, fully indemnified, consulting retainer to ensure the external partners remained calm and cooperative while the administrative transition occurred. Instead, driven by a bizarre, fragile need to prove their absolute dominance, they slammed the door shut, deadbolted it, and essentially set the porch on fire. They demanded all the benefit of my specialized expertise with absolutely zero respect for my personal exposure. Meanwhile, back at the corporate headquarters, Blake was putting the finishing touches on a masterpiece of corporate gaslighting. He eagerly blasted an all-staff email regarding my sudden departure to thousands of employees across the country. He did not frame it as a termination. He framed it as a bold technological triumph. As we rapidly accelerate our journey toward a fully agile operational model, Blake wrote, utilizing every meaningless buzzword at his disposal, the legacy risk coordination tier is being comprehensively restructured through advanced artificial intelligence-driven automation. We thank Ivy for her past contributions as we modernize our operational workflows for a faster, leaner, and infinitely more dynamic future. It was brilliant in its absolute superficiality. Hundreds of junior project managers, field engineers, and financial analysts read that brightly toned email and assumed it was just another routine, slightly annoying administrative shuffle. They genuinely believed an upgraded software patch was simply taking over a few outdated spreadsheets. None of them realized that the human shield protecting their massive project budgets, their critical timelines, and their fragile vendor relationships had just been completely disintegrated by an executive whim. In those few, intensely arrogant hours between 8 in the morning and lunchtime, the leadership triad accomplished something spectacularly destructive. They truly thought they were simply trimming the fat, cutting unnecessary expenses, and accelerating the corporate machine into the future. They had absolutely no idea that by instantly terminating my employment, skipping the mandatory handover period, and unilaterally swapping the named certifier in the software system without a single shred of external approval, they had done the one thing you must never do in the unforgiving world of high finance. They did not just fire the gatekeeper, they gleefully blew up the only legal bridge that allowed them to authorize a replacement. I unlocked the door to my apartment just before noon. The silence inside was absolute, a stark contrast to the sterile hum of the executive suite I had just been exiled from. In cinematic portrayals of corporate betrayal, this is the moment the protagonist drops her keys, slides down the wall, and breaks into uncontrollable sobs, or perhaps furiously calls her closest allies to vent about the profound injustice of it all. I did neither of those things. I did not shed a single tear. I did not reach for my phone to seek validation. I simply took off my suit jacket, draped it meticulously over the back of a chair, poured myself a glass of cold, filtered water, and sat down at my dining table. I opened my personal laptop. Over the past decade, Recognizing the inherent volatility of the executives I worked under, I had negotiated strict terms in my own employment contracts that allowed me to maintain a secure, offline, and entirely legally compliant archive of the foundational documents I had personally drafted. This was not company property I was stealing. It was my own authorized legal armor, retained explicitly for the purpose of personal liability protection. I bypassed the standard folders and opened the heavily encrypted drive. I needed to see the exact, unalterable text of the covenants. I pulled up Schedule R. I opened the massive PDF files containing the insurance confirmation letters from our primary underwriters in London and New York. I loaded the tax partner addendums and isolated the specific, dense clauses governing the certification of completion for our three largest active hyperscale campuses: the Desert Build in Nevada, the high-density expansion in Virginia, and the newly broken ground in Ohio. I did not read through the suffocating, microscopic legal prose to discover something new. I read it to confirm the exact dimensions of the trap Kestrel's leadership had just enthusiastically stepped into. The legal language was cold, unforgiving, and utterly precise. Every single paragraph reinforced the reality I already knew. The mechanism was brutally simple, designed specifically to prevent the exact kind of reckless executive meddling Gavin had just executed. The covenants clearly stated that if the named certifier was removed from their role without the explicit prior written authorization of the entire syndication chain, and without executing the mandatory transition overlap period, every single open disbursement package across the entire portfolio immediately lost its reliance validity. In the practical, physical world of infrastructure construction, a loss of reliance validity meant the banks were no longer legally bound to wire the money. It meant the insurance companies could void their coverage of active construction zones. It meant the entire financial ecosystem that fed the concrete trucks and the fiber optic crews would instantly freeze. I opened my personal email client. I needed to give them one final, undeniable chance to recognize the detonator they were holding. I drafted a very short, perfectly polite message to Mara Sloan. "Mara," I wrote, my fingers moving steadily across the keyboard. "Before my system access is permanently revoked and my credentials are deleted, can you please confirm if the company has received the required external syndication approvals to replace my role as the named certifier?" I hit send and waited, watching the digital clock on my screen tick forward. It took exactly 14 minutes for her to reply. I opened the message and stared at the screen, clinically analyzing the precise wording she had chosen. "All required corporate steps have been completed," Mara wrote. "Thank you for your cooperation." It was a masterpiece of ignorant hubris. It was the kind of answer a junior lawyer gives when they are trying to sound authoritative while completely missing the fundamental premise of the question. She was answering a question about internal human resources policy and executive charter bylaws, completely, fatally blind to the fact that I was asking about external financial survival. Her statement was internally accurate and externally catastrophically false. She had just documented, in writing, that Kestrel was proceeding with a material change to the financing structure without consulting the entities providing the financing. As I closed the email, my phone vibrated intensely against the wood of the table. It was another frantic, aggressively cheerful message from the Human Resources Department, following up on the transition consulting addendum they had sent to my personal inbox earlier that morning. They were pushing hard, demanding a signed copy before the close of business. The recruiter used soft, manipulative language, talking about preserving my legacy at Kestrel and urging me to help the company transition smoothly over the next few weeks. I felt a cold, profound wave of disgust. I read the addendum again, tracing the specific lines where they actively stripped away my corporate indemnification. They were asking me to absorb the immense ethical and legal liability of certifying multi-million-dollar infrastructure milestones on a freelance basis. They wanted me to take on all the risk without the network access to actually verify the engineering data, without the legal protection to shield my personal assets from a lawsuit, and without the internal authority to reject fraudulent claims made by project managers desperate to meet Gavin's new, accelerated deadlines. They essentially wanted me to be a human shield for a system I no longer had any power to control. I did not reply to the human resources representative. I simply deleted the message thread. I waited until the afternoon sun began to cast long, sharp shadows across the floor of my apartment. I wanted the business day to be entirely complete. I wanted all their internal transition memos to be sent, all their self-congratulatory meetings to be concluded, and all their automated system reassignments to be fully locked in. At exactly 4:46 in the afternoon, I opened a new, blank document on my laptop. I did not write a manifesto. I did not outline their strategic mistakes, defend my 12 years of flawless service, or predict their imminent financial downfall. I drafted a formal, legally binding notice of resignation. I was not resigning from my employment. Gavin and Blake had already terminated that. I was formally resigning from every single appointed, statutory, and neutral party role I held across the entire network of external contracts, effective immediately. I meticulously listed the specific legal titles. I resigned as the named completion certifier. I resigned as the transition risk officer. I resigned as the designated independent liaison for the tax equity syndicate. I cited the specific clauses in Schedule R that allowed me to unilaterally withdraw my name from the covenants if my capacity to perform the duties was materially impeded by the sponsor company. By firing me and locking me out of the systems, Kestrel had legally impeded me. I signed the document digitally, utilizing the encrypted signature key recognized by our banking partners. I attached the single-page document to an email addressed directly to the board of directors, the legal department, and the executive suite. I read the email one last time before pressing send. There was not a single thread in the text. There was no bitterness, no anger, no desperate plea for them to reconsider. The language was as dry, sterile, and emotionless as the poured concrete foundations of the data centers I had spent over a decade protecting. The profound silence of that letter was the most terrifying part of the entire exchange. I was not launching a counterattack. I was not plotting a complex scheme of sabotage or seeking petty revenge. I was simply and cleanly removing myself from the equation. I was formally refusing to continue standing between the arrogant men who had ousted me and the natural, devastating consequences of their own administrative violence. I clicked send. The progress bar flashed for a fraction of a second, and the outbox emptied. I closed the laptop, stood up, and walked over to the large window overlooking the city. I watched the evening traffic begin to build on the highway below. A river of red and white lights flowing smoothly because the infrastructure holding it up was sound. I felt incredibly light. I had done absolutely nothing to damage Kestrel Arc Systems today. All I had done, precisely at 4:46 in the afternoon, was quietly unbuckle their seatbelt. At exactly 8 o'clock the following morning, the financial apparatus of Kestrel Arc Systems attempted to wake up. In the Dallas headquarters, a senior treasury analyst logged into the master disbursement portal to execute a routine wire transfer. The payment was for $65 million, specifically earmarked for a massive shipment of industrial high-voltage transformers required for the Nevada Desert campus. The analyst checked the appropriate boxes, verified the routing numbers against the invoices, and clicked Submit. Instead of the familiar green confirmation banner, the screen immediately flashed a rigid gray prompt. It read, "Reliance pending." The analyst flagged the error, and within 10 minutes, the issue was escalated directly to Reese Dalton, the chief financial officer. Reese, empowered by the hasty system overrides executed by the Information Technology Department the previous afternoon, confidently logged into the portal from his own terminal. He applied his newly minted executive digital signature to the $65 million package, fully expecting his supreme administrative access to clear the blockage. The banking syndicate's automated clearing software intercepted the signature, cross-referenced it with the legally binding master facility appendices, and rejected it in a fraction of a second. The banking system did not recognize Reese Dalton. The external portal did not care about internal corporate promotions or executive charter mandates. It only recognized the mathematically precise cryptographic key assigned to the authorized, legally recognized named certifier. Reese was an imposter in the eyes of the algorithm. The failure in the Nevada disbursement was not an isolated incident. The architecture of trust I had built was highly interconnected, and the tripwires were being set off simultaneously across the continent, 1,000 miles away. The Virginia campus expansion hit a massive administrative wall. Sterling Harbor Underwriting, our primary insurer for the Eastern Seaboard projects, was scheduled to issue a temporary completion certificate for a newly constructed server hall. Their automated compliance sweep scanned the risk transition logs and found a sudden, unauthorized void where my credentials should have been. The underwriting software immediately placed the certificate on a hard hold. Without that insurance validation, the secondary lenders automatically locked their own approval chains. The Virginia campus, previously running perfectly on schedule, ground to an administrative halt in less than 4 minutes. The contagion spread rapidly from finance to operations. The engineering division received an urgent red-flagged communication from the regional power utility partner in Nevada. A massive test energization sequence, a highly dangerous and meticulously planned event designed to push high-voltage current through the newly installed substations, was scheduled for that afternoon. The utility company formally paused the schedule. Their liaison sent a stark message stating that the progress confirmation package lacked a legally valid signature from the designated risk officer. They flatly refused to flip the switch and risk a catastrophic electrical grid failure without the exact, contractually mandated liability clearance. By 9:30 in the morning, the physical supply chain began to snap. A crucial supplier of industrial lithium-ion battery storage units, based in the Midwest, placed a hard block on a massive outbound shipping order. The logistics coordinator for Kestrel called them, demanding to know why the freight trains were not leaving the rail yard. The supplier's response was entirely devoid of emotion or corporate courtesy. They operated strictly on escrow release protocols. They would only release the physical batteries when the multi-million-dollar escrow payment package was confirmed by the named individual in the contract or a legally recognized syndicate-approved successor. Until that specific digital handshake occurred, the batteries were staying exactly where they were. At 10:15, my personal cell phone rang. The caller identification displayed Reese Dalton's name. I let it ring 3 times, listening to the vibration against my kitchen counter, before sliding my finger across the glass. "Ivy," Reese said. His voice was a volatile mixture of forced executive politeness and escalating panic. "Good morning. I hope I am not interrupting anything." "You are not, Reese," I replied evenly. "What can I do for you?" "We are running into a slight technical hiccup on the disbursement dashboards," he said, trying to laugh it off, though the sound was tight and intensely anxious. "The syndication portal is throwing up some weird reliance errors on the Nevada transformers and the Virginia certificates. Information technology thinks it is a residual caching issue from yesterday's migration. But I figured you might know a temporary workaround, a backdoor code, perhaps, just to push these specific wires through while we clean up the back end." I poured a cup of black coffee, keeping my breathing steady. I kept my voice perfectly calm and completely devoid of any vindictiveness. "There is no backdoor code. Reese," I said clearly, "the system is not experiencing a technical hiccup, it is not glitching, and it is not a caching issue. The system is doing exactly what it was designed to do. You are attempting to alter the chain of custody and release tens of millions of dollars without the contractual authority to do so. The banks and the insurers are simply rejecting an unauthorized signature." "But Gavin authorized my signature yesterday," Reese protested, the panic finally bleeding completely through his polished facade. "Gavin authorized you on Kestrel's internal network," I corrected him. "He does not own the banks. I strongly suggest you tell him that." I ended the call and placed the phone face down on the marble counter. Back in the executive suite, Reese hurried into the conference room to deliver the news. Gavin Whitmore was sitting at the head of the table, casually reviewing marketing materials for a new corporate rebranding initiative. When Reese explained that the physical supply chain was freezing and the banks were rejecting his signature, Gavin aggressively waved his hand, swatting the crisis away like a minor, irritating insect. "It is just a friction point," Gavin declared confidently, his arrogance still entirely blinding him to the reality of the situation. "It is a consequence of moving too fast for the legacy software to keep up. Get the lead developers on a conference call with the banking IT department immediately. Tell them we have updated our internal roster and they need to whitelist your credentials. This is an administrative oversight. We will have it completely cleaned up in a few hours." But it did not clear up in a few hours. The delays did not resolve. They multiplied exponentially. A single rejected wire transfer for transformers metastasized into 3 entirely stalled megaprojects. The red alerts bled from the Treasury dashboard into procurement, then into engineering, and finally into the legal department's compliance monitors. Across the sprawling, open-plan offices in Dallas, the aggressive, triumphant energy from the previous afternoon completely evaporated. Junior managers began standing up from their desks, looking over the frosted glass partitions at their colleagues with expressions of deep, unsettling uncertainty. The swagger was gone, replaced by a creeping, cold dread. The realization began to dawn on the operational floor that the executives had not actually upgraded the system. They had accidentally unplugged the life support. This was the terrifying beauty of the architecture I had built. Kestrel Arc Systems was not under attack by a malicious external force. There were no aggressive short sellers coordinating a media campaign to tank the stock. There were no hostile corporate raiders attempting a hostile takeover. There were no federal regulators bursting through the doors with subpoenas. And there were absolutely no hackers compromising the mainframe. The company was simply and entirely paralyzing itself. It was being strangled by the very contracts it had signed to guarantee its own survival. Kestrel had not been breached. It had simply and effectively been deemed untrustworthy by its own financial DNA. And as the morning dragged toward noon, the digital lights across the company's entire operational stage continued to shut down, one by one, leaving them completely in the dark. It was exactly 1 o'clock in the afternoon when the first major external domino fell. This time, the blow did not come from a banking syndicate or an insurance underwriter, but from our most crucial revenue source. Northlake Compute was the anchor tenant for our primary fully operational facility. They were a titan in the artificial intelligence sector, and they were scheduled to wire a massive, non-refundable deposit by the end of the business day to secure their Phase 2 expansion into a newly built wing. Instead of a wire transfer confirmation, Kestrel received a highly formal, exceptionally polite email from Northlake's general counsel. They were officially pausing the deposit indefinitely. The legal phrasing in their notice was brief and surgical. They stated that the completion status of the master campus was no longer considered clean, because my name and my verified credentials had been stripped from the continuous certification registry. Northlake's automated vendor risk assessment algorithms had instantly flagged the entire Kestrel facility as out of compliance. They were preparing to install hardware worth far more than the building itself, and they absolutely refused to place that equipment into an environment that lacked independent, legally binding safety and power verification. Less than an hour later, a second critical artery was severed. The Kestrel Tax Department received a certified digital letter from Juniper Atlas Tax Partners. They were the financial entity responsible for purchasing our massive renewable energy tax credits, a complex transaction that the Kestrel Executive Board relied on entirely to balance the quarterly balance sheets and show a profit to the public markets. The letter from Juniper Atlas did not scream about a breach of contract, nor did it contain any aggressive language. It simply noted, with cold professionalism, that due to a material change in the independent oversight structure of the company, they were exercising their contractual right to initiate a repricing review. Specifically, they noted that the original named certifier had left the role without a legally pre-approved successor in place. In the high-stakes world of corporate tax equity, a repricing review was not a negotiation. It was a polite, heavily lawyered euphemism for slashing the value of the entire credit transfer agreement by at least 30% to account for the sudden surge in unverified risk. Then came the infrastructure fund. Redcliffe Pension Alliance was the primary capital engine driving the massive, multi-year new build in Ohio. They managed the retirement funds for hundreds of thousands of municipal workers across the country, which meant their risk tolerance was absolutely zero. They did not even bother sending an email to Gavin Whitmore. Their lead external counsel contacted Mara Sloan directly. In a remarkably quiet, steady voice, the lawyer informed our legal department that Redcliffe was temporarily suspending the next scheduled capital tranche, which was due to be released on Friday. Their justification was utterly bulletproof. They cited their explicit right to review and freeze all funding if the disbursement dossier lost its continuity of certification. The continuity had been broken, and therefore, the vault was slammed shut until a full, independent, third-party audit could be conducted. This is how true corporate catastrophes unfold. They do not announce themselves with blaring sirens, dramatic press conferences, or shouting matches in the executive hallways. The bad news arrived silently. It manifested as a sudden, chilling drop in routine email traffic, a series of deeply apologetic but immovable phone calls from mid-level associates at partner firms, and a steady influx of digital attachments filled with soft, diplomatic language that carried the destructive force of a legal wrecking ball. Kestrel Arc Systems was slowly suffocating under the immense weight of professional politeness. Gavin held out until the late afternoon, likely pacing his spacious office, trying to bully his internal teams into finding a magic override switch that simply did not exist. Finally, at exactly 15 minutes past 4 o'clock, my phone illuminated. It was Gavin. I let it ring twice before I answered, ensuring the connection was crisp and clear. "Gavin," I said, my voice maintaining the steady, neutral cadence of a seasoned negotiator. "I need you to explain something to me right now," Gavin demanded. He was trying desperately to hold on to his arrogant, superior tone, but the frayed edges of genuine panic were clearly audible in his breathing. "I need to know why our external partners are having a completely irrational, hysterical overreaction to a minor administrative update. You have poisoned the well, haven't you?" "You called them." I poured myself a glass of sparkling water, taking a slow sip before I replied. "I have not spoken to a single external partner since you escorted me out of the building, Gavin," I answered calmly. "They are not overreacting. They are simply following the exact terms of the covenants you inherited, but apparently never bothered to read. Those institutions did not invest hundreds of millions of dollars based on your charming personality or your verbal promise that the buildings would be finished on time. They bought into a highly regulated, tightly controlled process. That process was locked, secured by the name of a specific, neutral party who is held personally liable for the truth of the engineering data. You took a crowbar to that lock yesterday morning, and now the partners are simply walking away from the broken door." Gavin's tone shifted instantly from demanding to threatening. It was the predictable pivot of a weak leader, realizing he was entirely outmatched by the circumstances he had created. "Listen to me very carefully," Gavin hissed into the receiver, dropping the pretense of executive composure. "If you refuse to cooperate in good faith right now and help us fix this glitch, Kestrel will have no choice but to look very closely at your personal liability for the financial damages we are currently incurring. We have an army of lawyers. We will hold you responsible for this sabotage. We can tie you up in litigation for the next decade." I did not raise my voice. I did not laugh, even though the threat was legally absurd. I simply delivered the reality of his situation with surgical precision. "You cannot sue a private citizen for obeying the law," I reminded him quietly. "I have not touched a single server, sent a single unauthorized email, or accessed a single internal dashboard since my termination. I have done absolutely nothing to interfere with your operations. All I did was submit a formal resignation. I simply refused to continue lending my name, my spotless professional reputation, and my personal legal liability to a certification system that you explicitly banned me from accessing. You broke the machine, Gavin. I just refused to stand underneath it when the structural supports finally gave way." I disconnected the call before he could formulate another hollow threat. I set the phone down and looked out the window. By the end of the business day, The localized panic inside Kestrel's headquarters had begun to spread across the global financial wire. In pristine boardrooms high above the streets of New York, London, and Chicago, senior risk analysts and portfolio managers were doing exactly what Gavin, Blake, and Mara had arrogantly refused to do. They were opening the massive, dust-covered digital appendices of the master loan agreements. They were reading the microscopic print. They were tracing the interconnected clauses, highlighting the mandatory overlap periods, and calculating the immediate financial penalties of an unapproved certifier removal. They were finally looking closely at the invisible bridge I had spent 12 years maintaining. And as the evening approached, the audience of investors and lenders began to understand a terrifying truth. The frozen wire transfers and the paused tenant deposits from today were merely the precursor, the real storm, the catastrophic financial reckoning triggered by one impulsive 5-minute meeting had not even truly begun. At 6 o'clock the following morning, a full 3.5 hours before the New York Stock Exchange was scheduled to ring its opening bell, the atmosphere inside the Kestrel Arc Systems executive boardroom was already suffocating. The board of directors had convened an emergency session. The older, seasoned members who had flown in overnight looked grim, their tailored suits wrinkled, their patience entirely evaporated. For the first time in perhaps 5 years, the board explicitly banned the use of projected presentation slides. They did not want bullet points. They did not want executive summaries softly massaged by the public relations team. They demanded the physical, original binders of the master syndication agreements placed directly onto the mahogany table. Mara Sloan sat near the center of the table, flanked by towers of dense legal documents. The air conditioning hummed aggressively, yet a visible sheen of cold sweat coated her forehead. Under the piercing, unblinking scrutiny of the chairman of the board, Mara was finally forced to read the actual, unedited text of the external covenants. She traced her finger down the heavily indented paragraphs of Schedule R, reading the stipulations regarding the qualifications of a replacement certifier. The color completely drained from her face. The silence in the room grew heavy, stretching out until it felt like a physical weight pressing against the glass walls. "Reese cannot do it," Mara whispered, her voice barely carrying across the polished wood. The chairman narrowed his eyes, his tone dropping to a dangerous, icy register. "Speak up, Mara. Why exactly can the chief financial officer not sign a piece of paper?" Mara swallowed hard, flipping the thick page to point at a specific subsection. The covenants require strict independence. The certifier cannot have any direct prior operational involvement in the specific vendor approvals they are validating. Reese Dalton personally approved the budget variances and the emergency supplier swaps for the Nevada transformers and the Virginia cooling units. He is financially contaminated. If he signs as the independent certifier for packages he himself financially engineered, it constitutes a material breach of fiduciary separation. The banks will not just reject his signature, they will flag it as active fraud. Reese Dalton, sitting at the far end of the table, slumped back in his chair as if he had been physically struck. His supreme administrative access, granted so hastily the day before, was legally worthless. Gavin Whitmore gripped the edges of the table, his knuckles turning white. His temporary empire was crumbling by the second, and the older men in the room were looking at him not as a leader, but as a catastrophic liability. Sensing the distinct smell of blood in the water, Blake Harlan saw his opening. Blake was a creature of pure corporate ambition, and he understood that in moments of extreme crisis, the board did not necessarily want the right answer. They wanted a decisive narrative. He smoothed his silk tie, sat up perfectly straight, and adopted the somber, authoritative tone of a wartime general. "This is an optics crisis as much as it is a legal one," Blake announced smoothly, looking directly at the chairman and entirely ignoring Gavin. "The market is waking up. The lending syndicates are freezing our capital because they smell chaos. We need to send an immediate, unmistakable signal of discipline to the market. We need to show them that the adults are in the room and that reckless decisions have consequences." Blake paused, letting his words hang in the air before delivering the fatal strike. Gavin needs to step down, immediately. We announce a voluntary, temporary leave of absence to spend time with his family. It gives the syndicates a sacrificial lamb. As the head of strategic initiatives, I am prepared to step in as the transitional chief executive officer. I will personally oversee the audit of the disbursement packages and negotiate the cure periods with the lenders. We change the face of the company before the market opens, and we stop the bleeding. It sounded like a brilliant, ruthless, and necessary maneuver. The board members exchanged glances, nodding slowly. A quick decapitation would show the external partners that Kestrel was taking the compliance failure seriously. What the board did not know, what Mara had not yet found in her frantic reading, and what Gavin was too oblivious to understand, was that Blake Harlan was a walking, talking nuclear hazard. Blake was exponentially more conflicted than Reese Dalton. Over the past 12 months, driven by his obsession with lean operations, Blake had personally signed off on 4 separate internal memos pushing to accelerate the construction timelines at our 2 most critical campuses. In those memos, Blake had explicitly ordered the engineering teams to loosen the rigorous safety acceptance criteria to speed up the delivery of the server halls. He had actively lobbied to bypass the very risk mitigation protocols that the banks relied upon. Appointing Blake Harlan to oversee the compliance audit was the equivalent of appointing an arsonist to lead the fire department. Miles away, in the quiet sanctuary of my apartment, my phone vibrated silently on the kitchen island. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting long, pale streaks of light across the floor. I picked up the device. It was an encrypted text message from a former colleague, a senior compliance analyst who was currently sitting in the back row of the boardroom, taking the official minutes. The message was brief, urgent, and terrified. They are pushing Gavin out. Blake is pitching himself as the interim CEO to calm the banks. They are going to vote in 10 minutes. I stared at the glowing screen. All I had to do was type a single sentence. I could tell them about Blake's acceleration memos. I could point them to the exact internal server directory where his signatures were permanently logged. I could warn them that putting Blake in charge would instantly transform a severe contractual freeze into an irreversible default. But I did not let my fingers touch the keyboard. I set the phone face down on the marble counter. If I intervened now, my warning would be immediately dismissed as the bitter, vindictive sabotage of a fired employee. Blake would twist my words, claiming I was trying to undermine the rescue effort out of pure spite. They were fundamentally arrogant people who only respected power and leverage. They would never believe a warning spoken by a woman they had deemed an unnecessary expense. The only thing that could pierce their armor of hubris was the cold, unfeeling text of a legal document wielded by a multi-billion-dollar institution. I had to let them read the paper. Back in the boardroom, the vote was swift and unanimous. Gavin Whitmore, stripped of his unearned confidence, was formally asked to leave the room. He walked out of the glass doors, a completely broken prince. Blake Harlan stood up, buttoned his suit jacket, and accepted the mantle of interim leadership. Within 20 minutes, the public relations team blasted a polished, carefully worded press release to the Financial Wire. The internal communications network lit up with a company-wide memo. It spoke of leadership transitions, renewed commitments to operational excellence, and a steady hand at the wheel. The board collectively exhaled, genuinely believing that by swapping the nameplate on the chief executive's door, they had successfully extinguished the fire. They were spectacularly, fatally wrong. When the news hit the terminals in New York and London, the reaction from the lending syndicates, the tax partners, and the insurance underwriters was not relief. It was absolute, unmitigated horror. To the external entities holding the financial strings, this was no longer a single, isolated mistake made by an inexperienced legacy executive. The contracts mandated a strict 30-day cure period, a window of time allowed to fix a technical default before the penalties became permanent. By removing Gavin and elevating Blake within less than 24 hours of my termination, the board of directors had just triggered a second, massive seismic event inside the exact same cure window. To the risk algorithms and the managing partners at the pension funds, 2 consecutive power upheavals in a single day did not signal discipline. It signaled a catastrophic loss of control. It activated the most dreaded clause in corporate finance: material instability. The brilliant twist of the board's strategy was its ultimate undoing. My sudden dismissal the previous morning had severely wounded Kestrel Arc Systems, stopping its momentum and freezing its accounts, but it was not the killing blow. The decision the board made at 6:30 in the morning, the desperate, optics-driven maneuver they thought was a brilliant firefighting tactic, was the spark that finally reached the vapor. They had just kicked the gas tank, and now there was absolutely nothing left to do but watch the explosion. The financial markets operate on a brutal, binary logic. They do not care about a company's internal public relations strategy. They care about risk, and they care about the legal mechanisms designed to control it. When the press release announcing Gavin Whitmore's sudden departure hit the financial wire shortly after the opening bell, the board of directors genuinely believed they had thrown a bucket of water onto a grease fire. They thought they had demonstrated swift, decisive accountability to the market. The syndicates, however, read the exact same press release and saw a company in total, unmitigated freefall. By replacing the acting chief executive officer less than 24 hours after unceremoniously terminating the named completion certifier, Kestrel Arc Systems crossed a fatal, invisible threshold. This was no longer categorized by the banking software as a messy technical replacement. It was immediately reclassified as substantive control instability. The algorithms governing billions of dollars in institutional capital do not tolerate instability. They automatically engage the emergency brakes. The first devastating blow landed before lunch. Redcliffe Pension Alliance did not bother threatening Kestrel with a protracted lawsuit. Litigation takes years, and pension funds do not gamble with municipal retirement money. They simply invoked the cash flow protection rights explicitly hard-coded into their master funding agreement. With a single, mathematically precise digital notice, Redcliffe withdrew their entire upcoming capital commitment. In the span of a single heartbeat, $260 million of vital construction funding simply evaporated from Kestrel's ledger. The contagion moved with terrifying speed. Northlake Compute, already spooked by the initial compliance failure the previous afternoon, watched the executive suite collapse in real time. Artificial intelligence infrastructure requires absolute, unshakable reliability. They could not risk anchoring their most advanced hardware in a facility managed by a company undergoing a public meltdown. Their legal team formally canceled their option for the Phase 2 expansion. It was a clean, merciless severing of ties that wiped out $180 million in guaranteed future revenue and crucial immediate deposits. As the afternoon bled into evening, the tax equity markets delivered their verdict. Juniper Atlas Tax Partners executed their promised repricing review. Because Kestrel was now operating without an independent risk officer and had just decapitated its own leadership team, the risk premium attached to our renewable energy credits skyrocketed. Juniper Atlas slashed the valuation of the transfer agreement. The internal capitalization plan that the Kestrel board had locked in just weeks prior instantly suffered a catastrophic shortfall of $140 million. The bleeding did not stop there. Sterling Harbor Underwriting, watching the financial architecture crumble, moved to aggressively protect their own exposure. They refused to release the completion certificates for the Virginia campus and unilaterally imposed a massive mandatory contingency reserve fund. That single defensive maneuver completely froze $90 million in operational liquidity, cash that Kestrel's treasury desperately needed to clear the week's vendor payments and payroll. And because the ecosystem of digital infrastructure is intricately connected, the pain cascaded down the physical supply chain. A primary Tier 1 equipment supplier, noticing the frozen escrow accounts, immediately activated their capacity hold penalties and instituted surge price adjustments for the delayed shipments. Simultaneously, the syndicate holding our revolving bridge loan panicked. They triggered an emergency spread increase clause, jacking up the interest rates to punitive levels. Together, The supply chain penalties and the spiked interest rates carved out tens of millions of dollars more from Kestrel's rapidly disintegrating operating budget. Inside the heavily air-conditioned boardroom in Dallas, the atmosphere had devolved into a silent, suffocating nightmare. Blake Harlan was no longer standing tall. He was sitting at the head of the table, his face the color of wet ash, staring at the massive projection screen on the wall. The Treasury analysts were updating the master damage assessment spreadsheet in real time. They tallied the withdrawn capital, the canceled revenue options, the brutal tax repricing, the frozen liquidity, the supply chain penalties, and the punitive interest rate spikes. When the final sum calculated at the bottom of the screen, the number was so massive it seemed almost abstract. It was $800 million. $800 million of hard capital, future revenue, and operational liquidity, entirely vaporized in less than 36 hours. The most suffocating aspect of the catastrophe was the absolute absence of an external villain. There was no shadowy syndicate of short sellers coordinating a massive dump of Kestrel stock. There was no rival corporation executing a hostile takeover. There was no sophisticated group of international hackers infiltrating the mainframes and stealing trade secrets. Kestrel had simply committed administrative suicide. When the major financial news outlets began reporting on the collapse later that evening, the headlines scrolling across the bottom of the screens were brutally devoid of drama. The anchors did not speak of sabotage or conspiracy. They simply described the situation as a crisis of confidence due to executive structural breakdown. The market had looked at Kestrel's leadership, found them entirely lacking in fundamental competence, and mathematically priced them out of existence. I sat alone in the quiet dimness of my apartment, watching the city lights flicker to life against the darkening sky. My phone rested on the glass coffee table, occasionally vibrating as a steady stream of fragmented text messages arrived from my contacts still trapped inside the corporate headquarters. They sent me the breakdown. They sent me the final, staggering tally. I looked at the number glowing on the small screen. $800 million. In the movies, this is the moment the wronged protagonist pours a glass of expensive champagne, smiles wickedly at the skyline, and revels in the absolute destruction of her enemies. But as I sat there, absorbing the sheer scale of the financial carnage, I did not feel a single drop of vindication. I did not feel the intoxicating rush of revenge or the smug satisfaction of being proven right. Instead, a cold, heavy exhaustion settled deep into my bones. It was a profound, aching weariness. I thought about the 12 years I had spent meticulously building the very fail-safes they had so arrogantly dismantled. I thought about the thousands of hours of negotiation, the late nights parsing microscopic legal text, and the sheer willpower it took to keep that massive, fragile machine running smoothly. All of it had been destroyed in a 5-minute meeting by a man who wanted to look tough, enabled by a lawyer who refused to read, and cheered on by a strategist who only understood buzzwords. It was not a brilliant corporate victory. It was a completely senseless tragedy born of pure, unadulterated stupidity. It could have been avoided entirely if they had just bothered to understand the bridge before they decided to blow it up. Roland Whitmore landed in Dallas after a 14-hour direct flight from Tokyo. He did not go home to shower, and he did not sleep. He instructed his driver to take him straight to the corporate headquarters. He spent 9 consecutive hours locked inside his massive executive office, consuming the absolute wreckage of his empire. He read through the impulsive termination orders, the frantic internal emails, the unedited legal appendices, and the catastrophic financial readouts from the banking syndicate. When my phone rang late that evening, the caller identification displayed his private number. I answered it on the second ring, standing quietly by the window of my apartment. "Ivy," Roland said. His voice was entirely hollowed out. It lacked the booming visionary resonance that had built Kestrel Arc Systems from a regional startup into a global infrastructure powerhouse. He did not open the conversation with a dramatic apology. Men of his stature rarely do. Instead, he offered a deeply exhausted, quiet admission of failure. We simply did not understand the architecture. We did not comprehend the automated interplay between physically removing you from the building and the activation of those external protective rights. I did not attack him. There was absolutely no joy in kicking a man who was already watching his life's work burn to the ground. I kept my tone perfectly level, devoid of any emotional triumph. I explicitly advised Gavin and Mara to read the exact documents governing those covenants before they revoked my system access, I replied. I did not build a trap, Roland. I built a highly sensitive alarm system. The contracts merely operated exactly as they were designed to operate when an unauthorized breach occurred. I know, Roland said heavily, his breath catching slightly in the receiver. I have read the transcripts. I have read the master agreements. I have read everything. By the next morning, the board of directors had commissioned an emergency internal investigation. The resulting report was a masterpiece of corporate self-preservation, drafted by outside counsel who were highly motivated to isolate the blame. The document reached a purely clinical, devastating conclusion. It laid out the sequence of events with forensic precision. Gavin Whitmore had impulsively fired the singular executive holding the critical certification mandate. Blake Harlan had aggressively lobbied to cut the mandatory handover period to project an image of decisive strength. Mara Sloan had negligently confirmed the scope of legal approval, confusing internal executive power with external syndication rights. Finally, the board of directors themselves had reacted to the initial crisis by executing a destructive secondary power shift that permanently shattered the required continuity of the cure period. The investigation proved that no single person had deliberately tried to destroy Kestrel. They had simply murdered the company through a compounding series of fiercely arrogant, aggressively uninformed decisions. A few hours after the report was circulated among the executive committee, I received another phone call. This time, it was not Roland. It was an independent director of the board, a man specifically chosen because he had no prior history with Gavin or Blake. He was deployed as a neutral negotiator, tasked with executing a desperate rescue mission. His pitch was polished, urgent, and incredibly lucrative. He formally offered to bring me back to Kestrel Arc Systems. He did not just offer my old job back. He offered a promotion to Executive Vice President of Global Risk. He offered a base salary exceeding $2 million, backed by a massive retention bonus and a seat on the primary steering committee. He spoke of broad new authorities, sweeping structural reforms, and a public relations campaign that would essentially frame me as the brilliant savior returning to guide the company through the storm. To the untrained ear, it sounded like the ultimate corporate victory. It sounded like the perfect, vindicating end to a revenge story. The people who had cast me out were now begging on their knees, offering me a crown and a vault full of money to return. But I did not survive 12 years in risk mitigation by listening to the glittering surface of an offer. I listened to the mechanics of the transaction. I asked the independent director a very specific series of questions regarding my first 48 hours back on the job. As he explained the immediate operational priorities, the beautiful illusion of the offer completely disintegrated. I discovered the terrifying reality of what they actually needed. They did not genuinely respect my engineering expertise, nor did they suddenly value my strategic vision. What they desperately required was my signature and my spotless professional credibility. They needed a human comfort package to immediately soothe the panicked lending syndicates. The true moral hazard of their offer lay in the technical details. The director smoothly explained that upon my return, I would need to immediately sign the disbursement authorizations that had been stalled since my departure. "You want me to certify the progress reports," I said, clarifying his request. "You want me to sign off on the concrete pours, the electrical grid testing, and the vendor swaps that occurred over the last 4 days." "Exactly," the director replied, his voice brightening with false relief. "Once you apply your credentials to those stalled packages, the banking software will recognize your key, the Reliance status will be restored, and the frozen capital will begin flowing again. It will completely stabilize the market." A cold, hard knot formed in my stomach. The audacity of the request was staggering. "I have been entirely locked out of the Kestrel network for 4 days. I told him, my voice dropping to a low, razor-sharp whisper. I have not seen the physical inspection reports from the Nevada campus. I have not verified the insurance underwriting for the Virginia cooling units. I have not independently audited a single piece of engineering data since Tuesday morning. Yet you are asking me to apply my legal, indemnified signature to those milestones. You are asking me to guarantee, under penalty of federal financial fraud, that those operations were conducted flawlessly while I was completely blind. The director hesitated, the silence on the line stretching out uncomfortably. Ivy, we have the internal team standing by to assure you that everything is up to standard. We just need your formal sign-off to clear the administrative logjam. You do not want my risk assessment, I stated, stripping away the polite corporate fiction. You want my complicity. You want me to serve as a fresh coat of paint over a fractured foundation. If the new vendors Blake forced into the system fail next month, my name will be on the approval documents. I will be the one answering to the federal regulators, not Gavin, and not the board. This was the ultimate moral twist. If I accepted their millions of dollars and returned to Kestrel under those conditions, I would not be the triumphant victor. I would be validating their catastrophic mistakes. I would be actively helping carry out a cover-up meant to deceive the financial markets, willingly putting myself in serious legal jeopardy just to protect the fortunes of the men who had humiliated me. I declined the offer, I said softly, the finality in my voice echoing in the quiet room. I will not backdate a single certification, and I will not weaponize my reputation to shield this board from the consequences of their own incompetence. Do not contact me again. I terminated the connection before he could formulate a counter-argument. I placed the phone on the table, feeling a profound sense of clarity. I had just walked away from more money than I had ever been offered in my life. Yet I had never felt more secure. Less than an hour after I rejected the board's desperate plea, my phone illuminated with an incoming call from an unlisted international number. I answered it cautiously. The voice on the other end belonged to the managing partner of Redcliffe Pension Alliance, speaking on a conference line that also included the senior underwriters from Sterling Harbor. They were the apex predators of the financial ecosystem, the exact entities currently starving Kestrel of its lifeblood. They did not call to ask for a favor. They called to make a proposition. They recognized that the Kestrel Executive Board was entirely compromised and incapable of saving the physical assets. The syndicates were preparing to execute a hostile, distressed asset takeover to protect their billions of dollars in sunk costs. They were going to carve the company apart and salvage the operational campuses. We are preparing a rescue strategy, Ms. Perry, the managing partner from Redcliffe stated, his voice devoid of any warmth, purely transactional and intensely powerful. We are going to restructure the debt and forcefully acquire the primary data centers. We will not be saving the current executive administration. We intend to burn the Kestrel leadership structure to the ground. But to execute this acquisition safely, we need a chief architect of risk who deeply understands the buried liabilities of these specific facilities. He paused, letting the weight of the moment settle before delivering the final strike. We want to retain you as our lead strategic advisor for the hostile restructuring. We want you to help us legally dismantle them. The corporate death spiral is rarely a sudden crash. It is a slow, suffocating countdown measured in desperate phone calls and rapidly depleting accounts. Kestrel Arc Systems had officially entered the final 48 hours before their absolute liquidity deadline. This was the definitive point of no return. If the executive board could not unblock the frozen certification chain and magically restore the shattered trust of their institutional partners by the end of the week, the company would default on its bridge loans. A default meant surrendering to a forced, involuntary restructuring. They would lose their autonomy, their equity, and their unearned pride. With less than 24 hours remaining on the clock, the chairman of the board called me one last time. The polished, diplomatic tone from his previous attempts had completely evaporated. He sounded exactly like a man standing on the deck of a sinking ship, watching the final lifeboats row away into the dark. He was practically begging. He pleaded with me to return on an emergency. temporary basis, just long enough to apply my verified signature to a few critical documents so they could maintain a sliver of voting control during the impending bailout negotiations. "We will give you whatever you want," the chairman promised, his voice tight with exhaustion and fear. "Name your price. Just help us hold the line against the syndicates so we do not lose the entire company." I did not gloat. I did not raise my voice or remind him of the absolute disrespect I had endured in Conference Room B. I simply laid out my absolute, non-negotiable conditions. "My price is not financial," I told him, my voice projecting crystal clarity over the encrypted phone line. "If I step back into that ecosystem, Gavin, Blake, and Mara must be permanently stripped of all operational influence. They surrender their executive titles, and they vacate the premises today. The independent risk oversight protocols must be fully restored and permanently codified into the corporate charter. Furthermore, I will not blindly validate a single existing progress report. Every new certification will require a complete, ground-up reinspection by my designated teams. We do not paint over your mistakes. We dig them up and rebuild them." A heavy, agonizing silence fell over the line. It was the silence of a man weighing his own fragile ego against his ultimate survival. To accept my conditions meant the board would have to publicly and legally confess to their shareholders that the $800 million catastrophe was not an unforeseen market fluctuation. It was the direct, undeniable result of their own spectacular arrogance and profound incompetence. They hesitated. In the unforgiving arena of high finance, hesitation is fatal. They debated my terms behind closed doors, trying to find a clever loophole, a soft compromise, a way to save face while still saving their fortunes. They took far too long. While the Kestrel board deliberated, the clock struck 0, the liquidity deadline passed, and the trap slammed shut. The very next morning, the Financial Rescue Coalition, led by Redcliffe Pension Alliance and Sterling Harbor Underwriting, executed their contingency strike. They bypassed the Kestrel boardroom entirely and went straight to the distressed asset markets. They presented a merciless, legally bulletproof restructuring plan. They offered to purchase the most valuable, near-completed physical assets, specifically the Nevada and Virginia campuses, at a devastatingly deep discount. They would inject the hard capital needed to save the physical projects, pay the furious supply chain vendors, and keep the operational lights on. In exchange, the Kestrel executive leadership was entirely liquidated. This was the purest, most elegant twist of the entire ordeal. I did not return to Kestrel Arc Systems as a battered, vindicated employee forced to clean up the mess of the men who had humiliated me. When the emergency acquisition meeting convened in a neutral downtown law office, I did not sit on the Kestrel side of the table. I walked into the room wearing a tailored charcoal suit, carrying a fresh leather portfolio, and I took my seat firmly on the side of the acquiring syndicates. I was sitting there as the newly appointed chief risk architect for the consortium that was legally taking away Kestrel's crown jewels. The expressions on the faces of the Kestrel board members when they realized I was the one evaluating their asset surrender were worth far more than any inflated severance package. They had fired me to eliminate a perceived administrative bottleneck. Now, I was the absolute authority dictating the terms of their financial surrender. The karma was swift, clinical, and total. Gavin Whitmore vanished from the corporate power picture as rapidly and unceremoniously as the 5-minute meeting he had used to terminate my 12-year career. He was quietly escorted out of the building by private security, his legacy reduced to a cautionary tale taught in risk management seminars. Blake Harlan, the man who had desperately tried to reinvent himself as the wartime savior, was explicitly barred from holding any transitional role in the new entity. His strategic vision had proven to be a fatal hallucination. Mara Sloan did not even wait for the final acquisition documents to be signed. She submitted a quiet, immediate resignation, fleeing the blast radius before the full extent of her legal negligence could be published in the final, unredacted audit. The institutional syndicates were not vindictive monsters. They were purely rational actors. They recognized the true value of the company lay in the people who actually did the work. The brilliant junior engineers, the dedicated facility managers, and the exhausted treasury analysts who understood how to build and run the data centers were all retained by the new ownership consortium. They were given secure contracts and better resources. The only people who were systematically purged were the executives who had once confidently declared that deep institutional experience was simply too expensive to keep. They were fired by the very institutions that were paying to salvage the concrete and steel they had almost destroyed. The final scene of this corporate execution did not take place in the cold, aggressively air-conditioned executive suite where my ordeal began. It took place in a quiet, sunlit conference room on the top floor of a different skyscraper, all the way across the city. I sat alone at a long oak table, a cup of hot green tea resting beside my open laptop. I was reviewing the final, legally binding transfer deeds for the two main campuses. The signatures were verified. The capital was flowing safely once again. The massive cooling systems in the desert were spinning up, and the fiber optic cables were finally being lit. The structural integrity of the bridge was secure. I signed my name at the bottom of the final authorization page. I did not smile triumphantly. I did not lean back and revel in the destruction of the men who had tried to erase me. The satisfaction I felt was entirely quiet, deeply rooted in the immutable laws of cause and effect. I closed the leather portfolio, looking out the window at the sprawling Texas horizon, and spoke a single truth into the quiet room. I never destroyed them. I simply stopped standing between them and the consequences. Thank you so much for listening to this story. Please let me know where you are listening from in the comments below so we can connect and share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this, please subscribe to the Boss Revenge Stories channel, like the video, and support us even more by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by many more people.